Big Thunder Mountain is found at 4 of the 6 primary Disney dimensions. Though all these attractions seem identical, that is not the case. Today we're looking at the deviations that occur between Disneyland and Disney World. This is Parallel Disney. In Disneyland, Big Thunder Mountain is located on the east side of the Rivers of America, just off the bank. At Disney World, it's on the west and it's actually touching the river. When looking at the two attractions from overhead, we find that they are rather similar looking, but one key difference is that they are actually mirrored. Pretty cool, huh? After flipping one of the images, we are able to see the similarities more clearly as well as highlight the differences. Disneyland has a much smaller building that contains some of the queue as well as the loading area for the ride. In Disneyland, an area where guests were able to queue up and the ghost town of Rainbow Ridge was located, there is now just hot springs. This turn is covered by a wooden structure, but at Disney World it's a cave. Here, where there was just a cave system before in Disneyland, we now have the town of Tumbleweed. Before I go over this next difference, I made an overlay of the track to help explain it a bit better. This point appears to be the only real deviation of the track layout. At Disneyland, there's a fairly simple U-turn, but at Disney World there's kind of a figure 8 effect as it goes back under its own track. When comparing the two centerpieces, we find that the Rockwork is rather different. Disneyland's mountain appears to be a lot more weathered, not actually weathered, but theming-wise. There are cavities that go all the way through, and it dips in itself a lot, giving it a wavy kind of termite mound look to it. The Rockwork at Disney World has much straighter edges and a more apparent layering. The differences in the look of these two mountains is quite apparent, and you'll easily be able to tell that you're in Disneyland. Unfortunately, that's not the case for Disney World. At Disneyland, the bulk of the queue is located outside. You'll pass by some antique mining equipment, you'll go under an overhang of some rock, as well as the track. And that's a unique feature of Disneyland, is that you actually get to be on the inside of the track for a little bit during the queue. Because of this viewpoint, before even getting on the ride, you get a good view of Rainbow Ridge as well as the skeleton when the ride dips into the water. Speaking of water, there's this really cool water feature in the queue as well that cranks water up and puts it into a trough that brings it back into the river. After going back under the track, you then ascend into the loading area. Before making it to the top and getting onto the loading platform, there's this sign that mentions the coding system of the lanterns. As you make your way to the loading gates, you pass by a steam machine of some sort, and you see that the gates are actually made of rusty pipes. At Disney World, we find that the entrance is much more grand, but there isn't a water tower. Like at Disneyland, you'll find numerous mining equipment. We also find a similar tower that has water being hoisted up it and then going down a trough. I know I said there wasn't a water tower. I meant there wasn't like a water tower, not a tower with water. Unlike Disneyland, the queue at Disney World mostly takes place indoors and is heavily themed. For example, there's a vault with sparkling gold, a portrait of the Big Thunder Mountain, as well as a map with its mine shafts. We even find extensive interactive theming as well. Unfortunately, the wait times have to be pretty extensive for you to be able to experience all that there is. You can press down on some plungers to create thunderous explosions on the mountain. You can peer into mine shafts below through these sort of reverse periscope devices. In the ventilation room, you can spin some wheels that helps with the ventilation in the mine shafts, and you're rewarded with some zoetrope animation. You can also test the contaminants of various mine shafts by exposing canaries to that atmosphere. Luckily, the zoetrope animations are so entertaining, there's plenty of people constantly spinning in fresh air, so all the canaries seem to turn out just fine. A fun little feature of the Disney World queue is how you're actually elevated, so you actually get some pretty good views of the mountain while you wait. At Disney World, you find that you descend into the loading platform, where at Disneyland you ascend. The gates right before loading the ride are not nearly as nicely themed as the ones at Disneyland, but they're still solid looking gates. When it comes to the parallels of the ride vehicles, comparing the two engines seemed to reveal no real changes. Luckily, I was able to find a couple of differences when it comes to the cars. In Disneyland, we could see these 2 bolts down the middle. At Disney World, however, we find that there are 4 bolts around the sides. Another area of difference is how the cushions extend over the barriers at Disney World. Lastly, the wood grain effect at Disneyland looks much better. As we begin our journey in Disneyland, we find ourselves entering a cave very swiftly, and then we find ourselves confronted by numerous bats. Soon we find ourselves on the first lift hill, and we are ascended overlooking a pool of springs that seem to have some kind of luminescent properties. Near the top we find the ninth wonder of the world, the inside of water. As we start off our journey in Disney World, we find ourselves more or less staying inside all the way up to the cave. Once again we come across bats, but this time we see some glowing red eyes, and they're all around us, including overhead. As we begin ascending the first lift hill, we find some left behind mining equipment. As we get to the overlook at Disney World, we see that it is now lit with warm colors instead of the cool blue lighting. Also, the springs down below seem to only glow with orange light, while Disneyland seems to have a couple of different colors. They also no longer have a swirl effect. Once again, we are lucky enough to have the water parted for us so we can stay dry as we continue on this ride. After exiting this cave, we finally see the wildest ride aspect of this attraction. After passing several banking turns and going through various structures of rock, we find ourselves going under a tree with possums hanging on it, followed swiftly by a group of coyotes as we enter a cave and then exit a wooden structure. During this section at Disney World, we find a very similar thrill. However, this time we see saguaro cacti around instead of just kind of trees and other green brush. An interesting difference in the mountains is how at Disney World there's this thin archway. At Disneyland it's more like a cave. Here's a point where the tracks deviate as they're both turning in the same direction even though they're mirrored. After we get out of this cave, we finally see the possums in a tree. There's also now a new scene where we see the town of Tumbleweed. The town of Tumbleweed actually serves double duty as a show scene for Big Thunder Mountain as well as the Disney World Railroad. And here we see another unique feature as there are people in this Thunder Mountain. As we approach the second lift hill, we find ourselves going beneath the tower, and there's also a building with some equipment to the right. As we ascend, we find some tortoises, tortoise. Nearly the entire length of the lift hill has a shelf on the right that contains various equipment. Near the crest of the hill, we find a couple of rattlesnakes. As we make it over the edge, we find that there's a sign telling us that there's a blasting area ahead. There's also a goat chewing on some dynamite. That can't be good, as we're getting sprayed by skunks. Definitely not our day. As this crazy train once again makes haste, we get a chance to see one more critter, and that's a vulture on top of this rock. At least I think it was a vulture. As this moment of the attraction continues, I'd like to point out some of my favorite rocks. That one. This one over here. Ooh, that one's also nice. Anyways, eventually we find ourselves entering one of the mine shafts. In Disney World, as we approach the second lift hill, we find there's no longer a tower, but this time we go inside a structure that has some equipment instead of just next to it. Once we get past the building, we don't find any additional critters or equipment on the way up like we did at Disneyland. The only creatures we find on the top of the lift hill are some rams on the rocks. There also is no longer any dynamite. Once again, we see some saguaros, but no real trees like there were at Disneyland. As we head towards the mine shaft, this time, before we enter, we can see a Big Thunder Mining Co. sign overhead. The equipment outside the mine shaft is also dressed differently, but fairly similar. When we enter the mining shaft at Disneyland, we see various red lanterns warning us that we're entering a blasting area. Unfortunately, one of the lanterns seemed to crash on the fuse line. The lit fuse, now racing with the wire, eventually gets to some of its dynamite as it blows smoke in the ceiling. Unfortunately, up for you, you find a huge stack of dynamite and then the fuse hits it and blows up, but luckily you manage to escape. As we make our escape, we once again race around the mountain, eventually coming across an old dinosaur fossil, while at the same time splashing in some water. As the journey wraps up, we get a good close look at the town of Rainbow Ridge. Though it is a ghost town, if you listen carefully, you can sometimes hear the piano playing or even some people talking. And now we make our way back into the loading platform. In the mineshaft at Disney World, there's the rumbling of an earthquake. Luckily, there's no dynamite to worry about since this shaft has been abandoned a long time ago. If you look ahead, you see that the track continues onward in an upward direction, but unfortunately the earthquake must have shifted the rocks as we start to descend below. An additional interesting but subtle difference is how when we get to these doors in the ride, at Disney World there's considerably more cave beyond. Once again, we are seeing that Disneyland has more critters. If you look on the right, we see some mining equipment that wasn't at Disneyland. A little further down, we find a show scene that gets a little mixed up. At Disney World, there seems to be abandoned equipment that's just scattered about, but at Disneyland there was a campsite. Another subtle, interesting feature is how there are wood planks on the top of this tunnel at Disneyland. Once again, there is a fossil of a dinosaur, however this time we do not dip in the water. And now, instead of having a town of Rainbow Ridge, we go over some hot springs. We then see some more mining equipment off to the right, and then we make our way back into the loading station. And this concludes part 1 of my analysis for Big Thunder Mountain. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Also, if there's an attraction that you would like a report on, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.